My name is Q Williams. I'm the founder and CEO of World Class. I am a brain and mental performance coach for high achievers. This is all based off of my experience and my research experience, my experience having been to many doctors over the years, read many books on the topic of concussion and CTE. This is not medical advice. 4 main takeaways that I'm going to cover tonight is I want people in this workshop to basically understand a history of CTE in sport and the science. We're going to go through the fact checking and the myth busting that I have available to us, how the brain heals and rewires itself scientifically, and how you yourself can build your best brain hardware and software. And overall, what I want everyone to walk away with from this workshop with is an understanding of basically a sense of clarity and a sense of real direction with where they want to go with their brain health long term. So let's jump in. Let's start off by defining concussion, post-concussion syndrome, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. We'll start with concussion. The way that I think about concussion is kind of like a Jell-O mold inside of a glass container, like if it was sitting on your counter. Imagine that glass is your skull. And a helmet is meant to protect that glass from breaking. But a helmet cannot keep that Jell-O mold from shaking, potentially breaking, brushing up against the sides of that glass. And so what happens is in sport and a lot of head trauma incidents is that brain gets disturbed. And so you can have all sorts of symptoms that can come from that. They can come right away, they can come shortly after. But what's important with concussion is getting that diagnosed in the moment, and then having that time to slowly return back to play, to work, to social engagement, to screens. All that's very important. So when it's not, focused on and confronted in the moment, it can lead to problematic issues such as post-concussion syndrome. The next piece here. Post-concussion syndrome essentially is long-term extended concussion symptoms. The same symptoms you have from a concussion, if they're drawn out for longer than 3 months, you are considered to have post-concussion syndrome. And the longer that goes on, the less likely it is that you'll actually fully recover. So again, coming back to addressing this in the moment, after the moment of impact, noticing the signs and getting that diagnosed and treated. Next piece is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It cannot currently be diagnosed in the living. It can only be diagnosed in post-mortem instances. It's done by a study of the brain and tau buildup in the brain. So we're going to play a little game here. Fact or foolish? First question, first statement. To be diagnosed with a concussion, I have to be knocked unconscious. This is foolish. You do not need to be knocked unconscious. You do not need to experience all the symptoms of concussion in order to have been diagnosed with concussion. Last one, subconcussive impacts are the real problem, not concussions. Because it depends on what you consider to be the problem and who you ask. If you look at subconcussive hits, lower exposure and less early leads to better outcomes. So essentially, if you wait for your kid to play football or a head contact sport before the age of 14, that's better than letting them play when they're younger. This has led to a lot of different hit counts being added to sports, much like pitch counts in baseball. There are hit counts, practice counts, full tackle, football drills in college and in high school. But personally, I'm an advocate for essentially, I would like to go a little bit further when it comes to removing dangerous plays and dangerous number of hits, because subconcussive hits in today's literature does lead to what is considered CTE. Now, we can't say necessarily, though, that concussions are not a problem, right? Because concussions, when they're left undiagnosed, as mentioned earlier, they lead to long-term issues such as post-concussion syndrome. In my opinion, I think we need to be much more experiential when we educate our athletes and our kids when we think about, sending them out into sports. What I would love is for someone to have put goggles on me to essentially have me understand and realize what it looked like to have double vision, what it felt like to be nauseous after a concussion. I think there's a lot of opportunity there still to really teach on concussion so that folks can have an understanding of what that feels like and they can pull themselves out of the game. Let's talk about CTE, the stages of CTE. These are the symptoms and the symptom maps of the stages. So we talk about headaches, loss of attention, and concentration. These are stage 1 components. Of course, when you go to stage 2, you add in some more serious issues like add in depression, mood swings, explosivity. You start to actually introduce this dysfunction in executive functioning. So, and then you have trouble with language difficulties like slurred speech, that sort of thing. And then impulsive behavior, which can lead to, of course, it can lead to anything. It could lead to alcoholism. It could lead to gambling. It can lead to relationship issues, right? And then we have stage 3, where essentially it's elevated levels of all the things that are from stage 2. And then in stage 4, you add in different psychotic symptoms, such as paranoia and increased language and motor deficits, where there are serious implications. When folks think of CTE, they naturally tend to think of someone like this. This is Hernandez being taken out of his house. He was arrested, charged for murder, and then ended up taking his life and found to have CTE. We'll come back to this example in a few minutes here, but this is obviously a poster child for what people think of when they think of CTE. And my understanding is that there's actually a lot more that meets the eye when it comes to an example like this. So here's a long and drawn out timeline. This is just one page of 3. I'm going to catch the highlights of the concussion crisis. This is how we've gotten to this level of confusion. So it all started essentially, in my mind, back in 1994. Merrill Hodge retired from football due to post-concussion syndrome. And he comes up a little bit later in the narrative, of course, but in 2000, Mike Webster claimed that he had disability. He claimed he had psychological and cognitive issues, and he blamed the NFL for that. That case was actually hidden from the general population. And this is the start of some of the eventual backlash of hiding information that the NFL was later accused of. It turned out a couple of years later that Mike Webster did indeed have CTE. He was granted his disability, but he had already passed away, of course. He committed suicide. And in 2002, he became the first instance of CTE. And a couple of years later, Justin Strzelczyk dies, also from suicide, or expected suicide. Terry Long commits suicide a few years later. And in 2005, the NFL MTBI committee, they actually start saying that return to play doesn't actually increase risk of later injury. And this quotation down here at the bottom shows that. So those players who ultimately play in the NFL are probably less susceptible to MTBI and prolonged post-concussion syndrome than the general population. Essentially, their stance was, if you've gotten to this stage in your career, then chances are you're essentially, risk averse to concussion. Like, concussion doesn't really impact you if you've reached this far in your career. So it's really interesting, the narrative that started going on in 2005. In 2006, Chris Nowinski, the founder of Concussion Legacy Foundation, wrote a book called Head Games. That became an eventual documentary later in 2012. And everything that came out about that book is everything that I just talked about. So all of the hiding of information, the misinformation. And in 2007, research showed that concussed players were actually at risk for depression. This is all based on survey results and third-party evidence, not the NFL's data, and the NFL actually started to refute that data. In 2009, Chris Nowinski and his team of scientists actually crashed the Super Bowl that year. They went down to the Super Bowl, and him and Dr. McKee prompted a meeting with the NFL. They ended up speaking with them a week later, and there started to become a bit of some momentum as far as the NFL goes when it comes to addressing this issue. So the NFL in 2009 acknowledges some sort of like long-term effects as far as concussions goes. And then in 2010, CTE was actually found in Owen Thomas, a college player who actually had zero history of concussion. So the concussion story takes a twist. And not only was Owen Thomas the first college player to have CTE, but he also had no history of concussion. So very quickly, the conversation around CTE goes in the direction of subconcussive blows. Can subconcussive issues be the culprit here that's at play? And in 2012, of course, Chris Nowinski's documentary came out. This is the same time I was actually in my master's program learning about this issue. And the same year, Junior Seau commits suicide, also had CTE. And the case against the NFL was actually agreed upon. The NFL would pay $765 million to former players that claimed issues long-term. 2013, a PBS special followed up that documentary with a long PBS special called League of Denial, the NFL's Concussion Crisis. And in that special, Dr. Ann McKee of Concussion Legacy Foundation reported CTE in 45 of the 46 NFL players that she examined, all the brains that she had examined. And a couple years later, many other lawsuits were filed. Federal court actually eventually got involved and adjusted how much money the NFL was supposed to pay those players. It ended up being bumped up to $5 million. But in 2016, the NFL finally comes out and says that there is a connection, there's a link between football and CTE and dementia and those sorts of neurodegenerative diseases. So the coined term is here, the executive vice president said, the answer to that question is certainly yes. There is a link between those two things, concussion and between football and their neurodegenerative disorders. A year later, in 2017, Dr. Ann McKee pushes that study even further and says 110 out of 111 former NFL players had CTE. So same study, just much more aggrandized. This was actually published in the New York Times. And this is the same year that Aaron Hernandez was also quoted as having CTE as well. Later on, of course, I'll go into this example a little bit more, but Aaron Hernandez was also featured in this documentary called Killer Inside the Mind of Aaron Hernandez. In this documentary, we learn all about Aaron Hernandez's history, not just his concussion history, but his life history, and how important and foundational his upbringing, his sexual tendencies, the people that he hung out with, all of his lifestyle and sort of nurture aspects of his biology were released. So this is a very interesting finding. And in 2020, the focus of most folks in the concussion world really turns to mental health. Concussion Legacy Foundation, they focused their entire gala in 2020 around mental health. And of course, the Aaron Hernandez example really pulls forward the need to really address mental health. And of course, you can see now how much of a focus there is in the NFL, NCAA, and different sports around the world on mental health with athletes. One thing I didn't mention is in 2018, Merrill Hodge published a book called Brainwash, The Bad Science Behind CTE and the Plot to Destroy Football. This is really the first instance of someone big and reputable coming out and saying that they don't believe the science. They don't trust what's been put out there. And I have read the book cover to cover, and Merrill makes a lot of really good points. And I'll posit his points against Dr. McKee and Chris Nowinski's, of course, in a minute here. But it's the first of its kind, and it's really, really interesting. And it started making me question a lot of the things that I had expected as far as this conversation goes. So, what I would like to talk about are a couple of new characteristics that have been coming about in the last couple of years. So in 2018, there was a study done up in San Francisco with some functional neurologists. If you guys have ever heard of Sidney Crosby's big concussion episode in the NHL back in like 2011, I think it was. Sidney Crosby was eventually cured by a doctor that specialized and created a type of treatment called functional neurology. And his name is Ted Carrick. So Ted Carrick essentially cured Sidney Crosby's issues. And I'm actually currently seeing a functional neurologist that studied with Ted Carrick. But anyways, Ted Carrick co-published a study where he studied post-concussion syndrome patients. And they had a hunch. They had a hunch that a lot of the symptoms that post-concussion syndrome patients were experiencing happened to align with Lyme disease and what was going on with Lyme patients. So they did a test. They did a study with all the patients that had been through their clinic. And out of 217 patients of theirs, 38% had a positive Lyme test. So it's the first study of its kind, and it begs the question, what's really going on here? Does someone like me, for instance, have post-concussion syndrome, or does he have exaggerated symptoms due to something like Lyme disease? Because when a concussion happens and post-concussion syndrome happens, the blood-brain barrier is actually compromised. And what can happen is if you have Lyme disease in your system from maybe when you were a kid, such as myself, growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right over here, this is where Lyme disease is really, really prevalent. So if that's in my system, I take a blow to the head or thousands, that Lyme can enter my brain. It can start to impact me neurologically. And the good news is Lyme is actually treatable. Interesting caveat, sort of segue that might be worth investigating on your own. Another interesting study from 2019, the Nun Study it's called. It's been going on for several years, several decades. And a quote from the study says, essentially, the circuitry of the cerebral cortex may remain functional despite the presence of Alzheimer's disease. So essentially, these nuns were studied over the period of their lifetime, their late lifetime. And they lived really good lives. They lived lives of meaning, life of servitude, life of devotion, of course, and life of community. They also kept up a pretty decent exercise routine. A lot of nuns are pretty fit, and they took care of themselves. And it turns out a lot of them actually had Alzheimer's disease when they studied their brains. So they had Alzheimer's disease in their brain. They had that pathology, just like some folks can have tau and tau buildup in their brain for CTE. But they didn't show any signs of that. They didn't display Alzheimer's when they were alive. So this really begs the question of how much does our pathology and our biology really impact how we show up in the world? A lot of us are really used to thinking, oh, I've been hit in the head, or oh, I have Alzheimer's disease, or maybe, I have an injury and therefore this is what I'm left with. But how cool is the power of mindset, the power of lifestyle in this example, where essentially the way that we see something, the way that we live our life can actually influence our biology and our presentation in the world, in the life that we live. Really interesting stuff here. So there's some popular opinions that I mentioned earlier around concussion and CTE. And the first one, of course, goes to Chris Nowinski, who published the first book in 2006. And of course, Merrill Hodge, who most recently says that all that data is BS. I talked about the 110 out of 111 former NFLers and their brains that showed CTE. Merrill Hodge essentially says all that research is biased, and it's actually harmful to come out and say that football causes CTE. It's a disservice to our population. And I have some notes here I want to make sure I read off. Essentially, Merrill Hodge partners up with Dr. Cummings, Peter Cummings. He's actually based out of Boston as well. And he says essentially that genetics play a role in the severity of dementia. In fact, there's a gene in our system. It's called TMEM106B. It's a long code, but it's a single gene in our system that if that's present in someone, then they have a 2.5 times more likelihood of developing dementia. And so this shows that essentially genetics can play a role in how severe a case of CTE can get. Doesn't necessarily mean that you would get CTE if you have this gene. It just means if you happen to get CTE and you have this gene, it could be worse. So genetics are at play here. Good science is also hard to create and hard to find. Merrill Hodge talks about the bias of a lot of the studies. Of course, when you go to Concussion Legacy Foundation and their research, you look at the number of brains that they studied. The brains that they studied, those 110 brains, were all donated by families that thought their loved one had neurocognitive issues, had trouble with mood, depression, with anxiety, with maybe they had an alcohol problem, maybe they had addictions. So these were reported because of life experience. And so therefore there's a bias in that study. By claiming that this is a representation of the NFL, it does definitely push the envelope there. That is a bit egregious and a bit irresponsible in many ways, because there's no control involved there. There's no control of the general population, of the general NFL. It's only reporting on folks that showed problems while they were living or reported them. Also, he cites chronic inflammation actually is associated with tau deposits. So essentially, chronic inflammation could actually be the problem at play here. It might not be that football causes it, but it's this inflammation itself. What I say to that is that concussion causes inflammation, and therefore inflammation can cause CTE and tau deposits, right? He also claims that obesity is linked to CTE. He talks about the increased risk of degenerative diseases in those who are obese. And a lot of players that end up having CTE were also obese and did not take care of themselves. Talks about diabetes as well, how prevalent diabetes and how that leads to long-term brain issues. And a very big doctor in the CTE space, Joseph Maroon, on the same side of this argument on the right-hand side here, talks about diet. When he talks about like trying to avoid CTE, he talks about, focusing on your diet, focusing on your active recovery, using CBD and cannabis, avoiding alcohol, avoiding drugs, and really try to control stress. And it turns out on the left-hand side here, everyone at Concussion Legacy Foundation agrees with that. They would agree that diet, active recovery, and controlling stress are good ideas for those that have sustained head trauma. So we're starting to see a bit of a trend, at least here, where these two things do come together, and there are some solutions moving forward. So moving forward, that's what I'm really gonna focus on, okay, for this next so long here, next half of this workshop. Move. So this is where I tend to find a middle ground. And it's also where I look to see a furthering of the discussion around concussion and CTE. My truth, and the truth that I've studied the most, is that our experiences shape our reality. So just like the Nun Study that we talked about, our experiences shape our reality, how we live our life. For those of you not familiar with it, the quantum theory is something that Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr actually butted heads on way back about 100 years ago. They butted heads on whether or not our thoughts could actually produce outcomes. Our probability, our thoughts and predictions within our mind can create a quantum experience in the world. So Niels Bohr challenged the idea that everything has to be measured by saying that essentially our brains and our thoughts can create outcomes. So this quantum theory really hasn't been adopted in the last 100 years. It's only recently starting to catch fire. This is where we're really starting to see the power of mindset, the power of emotional intelligence, and the study of those things and the proof behind it. Another piece of this is nature versus nurture, epigenetics. So I talked about genetics, right? This single gene that can be in our system that can lead to further damage and further inflammation as far as CTE goes. Now, epigenetics actually says the exact opposite of what most of us are taught when it comes to genes. What we're usually taught is that genes create an outcome, right? That a lot of that is not true. Epigenetics shows that nature is actually much more powerful than nurture. I'm sorry, excuse me. Nurture is much more powerful than nature. How we treat ourselves, how we show up in the world, how we experience life, what trauma has gone in our life, what sort of diet we take on. This is how we can influence our genetic expression and actually change it, whether it's with our thoughts, whether it's with our actions, whether it's with what we put in our bodies, what we put in our brains, as far as news consumption, those sorts of things. So Dr. Joe Dispenza was actually able to prove this. Folks that had diabetes when they were given the opportunity to either watch a lecture or watch a comedy. And the folks that watched a comedy and laughed their butts off for an hour, they actually experienced a 20% decrease in their insulin levels. So their laughter, their ability to be jovial, what they consumed, all of that played an impact in their genetic expression. So he took it a layer deeper and said it's the genetic expression. There were 23 different genes that were impacted by watching this funny comedy and by laughing, by having fun. So we're seeing proof that epigenetics is true. So let's get into a case study. We talked about this a minute ago. Aaron Hernandez. When we look at Aaron's life, most of us look at it as a murderer, right? A felon, a drug abuser, someone who committed suicide, someone who was very violent, someone who characterizes everything that you think of when it comes to CTE, right? Now, what the documentary puts forth is much different. We start to see some new things about Aaron. We start to learn really what happened with Aaron, what happened to Aaron, and how Aaron looked at the world. So Aaron was actually a closeted bisexual. And when you look at a picture like this, you start to really understand that maybe there's a lot more going on with Aaron than anybody could have ever predicted. So he had an alcoholic father. He lost his father at a young age, had a really traumatic experience with that. He experienced sexual abuse at age 6. He also might have been using steroids. Another example of this nurture characteristic, right? So what happens to us and what traumas we take on maybe as a kid, can those play a role? This is basically a grid of all the symptoms that folks experience with long-term brain damage. And then on the top is some different remedies and approaches that folks like me take on trying to mitigate the risks and really reduce these symptoms. So I'm going to simplify this and flip to the next slide. These are the ones we're going to focus on today, okay? Adaptogens, breath work and meditation, red light laser therapy, emotional intelligence, and emotional awareness, just what we talked about a minute ago. So we're folding this into how I approach post-concussion syndrome and CTE. Cold exposure, yoga, and movement. We'll talk about those here in a second. What I've developed is essentially a 3-pronged approach to this topic. And it starts with the idea of slowing down. So essentially, what I mean by that is slowing down the nervous system and stimulating the vagus nerve, the biggest nerve in our body. It runs straight from up here all the way down through our system. It's a nerve that can actually be calmed. It essentially activates the part of our body that wants to rest and digest and recover from stress. So think inflammation, right? Inflammation on the brain. Rest and digest is the system we want to be in. That's called the parasympathetic nervous system. And take a big deep breath in and exhale like you're fogging up a window. Just like that. It's like you're fogging up a mirror in front of you. Now, if you do that with your mouth closed, just pretend you're still fogging up that mirror, but your mouth is closed. You'll do something called Ujjayi. It's called Ujjayi pranayama. It's just a breathwork technique used in yoga. And it stimulates that nerve. So go ahead and take a big deep breath in. Close your mouth and fog up the mirror. Feel a vibration right back here in your throat. You are stimulating the vagus nerve. And you are getting yourself into rest and digest. Instant anxiety cure, instant stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system so that your brain and your body can relax. One of the biggest symptoms of CTE and post-concussion syndrome is a heightened level of anxiety and stress. So by stimulating that nervous system, we're able to slow things down. So number 1 is slow. Number 2, I call this allow. And actually, I'll pop everything on here. So what I first talked about here was meditation, right? Breath work, yoga, and movement. These are all ways to stimulate that vagal nerve. The second piece is allow. I call this allow because essentially it's allowing things in, allowing things into my body and around my body to support me. So this is intake and therapeutics. Things that I use that have been proven to have a link to supporting your brain long-term are reishi and lion's mane mushrooms. I consume these every day. I drink something called mud water every day in the morning. It replaces my coffee as a stimulant. So reishi is actually proven to possibly promote nerve and brain health. Lion's mane mushroom may actually protect against dementia, reduce mild symptoms of anxiety, and it might also help repair nerve damage. It's also a strong anti-inflammatory. It's like a superfood. So I consume that every day as a way to protect my neuroinflammation and for overall better brain health long term. What's also been shown about these mushrooms, though, is that it's all about sustaining that. So keeping these in your system, if you were to end using these mushrooms, the benefits do go away. So continue to use these. Continue to use these to fuel you. CBD is one of the only things in our ecosystem that can break the blood-brain barrier and decrease inflammation. In studies, CBD has actually been shown to reduce or remove the impact of inflammation, oxygen buildup, and different like brain cell declines. So inflammation, reducing that has been shown to decrease the impact of Alzheimer's. And of course, that is linked to dementia and CTE. So CBD is good for that. Red light therapy. This is something that my functional neurologist I mentioned earlier uses on me. So he uses a laser actually. Lasers, red light lasers can actually penetrate the skull. They can go right through the skull. And I can't feel it, of course, but I can feel, what I get is an impact on my brain that reduces inflammation. It increases ATP, energy production in the brain. It helps create brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's that's a tongue twister. BDNF, it's called. That essentially helps rebuild the brain. It increases neuroprotection and brain repair. It also reduces inflammation in the brain. So it's a really effective tool. It can be used either in laser form, or you've probably seen those different light therapies like Juve. Those are helpful in mitigating long-term brain issues. It's pretty cool. It's actually been shown that there's a positive effect of red light therapy on the brainwave patterns just after one treatment. And I can tell you from my experience, I experienced it right away. Cold therapy is another one. I jump in a freezing cold tub of ice every morning. There's some incredible benefits. Not only does this like really heighten your mood, but biologically, it shoots fresh blood to your brain. It increases cerebral spinal fluid flow. It resets the brain essentially, sending thousands of different signals to it from all the cold sensors around your body. And if you think about it, it's a very natural thing that we would do if we were still cavemen and girls, right? We would jump into a freezing lake once in a while to bathe. It would be good for us. We would be left to the elements very often, and we would be cold. And our body would have to fight and create a new system, essentially a reset, that supports us in decreasing inflammation, activating the nervous system, and also all of these just great feel-good chemicals like norepinephrine and serotonin that are released into the brain. So great tool for those that are worried about their long-term brain health. Let's see. The next piece is create. And we just talked about biological things, right? We talked about things you can do, like breathing, sending more cerebral spinal fluid up into your brain to cleanse that brain, meditating, slowing down. We talked about things you can intake and add as therapies to your life. Now I want to talk about what life looks like. I want to talk about creating things. I want to talk about what kind of life satisfaction you have. So I call this acting on purpose. And when I say act on purpose, I mean like, I'm not just going through the motions, like I have something I'm up to. This in particular has been one of the most foundational shifts in my own recovery from post-concussion syndrome. About 2 years ago, I entered into an emotional intelligence training. I hired a coach. I surrounded myself with men that were powerful, that were up to big things, that could mentor me in a way that my brother, my dad, and my friends just couldn't do. And I started elevating myself and expecting more of myself than a previous version of myself. Like I said, 6 years went by when I was in a corporate job, knowing all along I wanted to be an entrepreneur and serve this community. And what really flicked the switch in my recovery was finally pursuing that, finally acting on purpose. So this is tribe. This is having a mission. This is having a mindset to go after that mission. And I'm going to expand on this. I want to talk about a few things. So something we haven't touched on is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is also a newer idea, right? For so long, we've been taught and thought, and research has shown that essentially our brains are hardwired. Like you can't change it. And in fact, I have a big picture right there on the wall, show as a reminder to myself that this is how we used to think of the brain. That there's an area of the brain for perception, for problem solving, for creativity. There's an area, called cerebral cortex, where we do a lot of our reasoning and forward thinking. There's all these different parts of the brain that are associated with fear. And that's how it is, right? So if you damage a part of the brain, then you lose it, right? That's always kind of been the thought. So if you have a concussion, or if you have a brain injury, or maybe a stroke in one area of the brain, then you're screwed, Your sense of fear is gone, or your sense of creativity is gone forever. That's the way we used to think of the brain. What neuroplasticity has introduced in the last couple decades is that that's just not true. It's just not. Our brains can actually rewire themselves. So of course, you've seen all these different brain apps on the market. You've seen things that can train your brain contextually, problem solving wise, right? Like playing all these different games. The same thing goes with our thoughts. The way that we think about a problem in our life, or maybe CTE at large, plays an impact with how our brain wires and fires. So I talked also about the mind-body connection. Mind-body connection, when I talk about, say, when I talk about the parasympathetic nervous system and the nervous system, that's what I'm talking about. The connection of our bodily sensations with our mind, okay? So essentially, what's unique about this is I talked about the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. One is focused on survival. It's the sympathetic nervous system. It's our drudgery. It's our going and working in our normal jobs, in our normal way of life, staying in our comfort zone, just surviving, just making do, just paying the bills, just being able to do everything that we got to do, right? It's a have to sort of thing. That's a survival mode. That's a survival mechanism in our life. And that also shows up in our biology. So if our body is always in this sympathetic state, stressed, chronically inflamed, chronically just trying to get the next meal in, chronically just trying to, meet someone else's level of success, that is also a survival trait. And that creates a survival environment in our body. And that leads to inflammation. It leads to chronic stress. That leads to all of these downfield and downstream issues associated with CTE. So what I'm here to address is, what are you doing and what decisions are you making as a human being that are in survival, that are just getting by, that are telling your body that it's okay just to get by, be inflamed, be reactionary. And what I like to counter that with is this idea of creation, this idea of tapping into our parasympathetic nervous system, finding balance in our body, finding balance in our thoughts, where we're creating, we're actively in partnership with our life. And I also want to talk about tribal service, the power of community. There's a book written by Sebastian Junger. He talks about the power of tribe and what tribalism, essentially being at war for so long. He was actually a journalist. He was a photographer, I believe, in the war. And he traveled and saw so much destruction overseas. And he came back and he started studying former military men and what their lives were like coming back. You started to realize that a lot of what made war bad also made life kind of good in the same way. Having a shared struggle, like being on a football team or a soccer team or in the military, having a shared struggle actually created a better outcome for those people's lives. Of course, the destruction was the double-edged sword side of it, right? The PTSD, the head trauma that can come with the military. But there's something to really be said for the tribe mentality, for the community, for getting rid of social barriers and really connecting with people. So these are all foundational areas that can actually accelerate our growth personally and get us into that parasympathetic state so that we can create and so that we can have long-term brain health. So next, what I want to talk about is essentially, if I can go and apply, this same model, right? This 1, 2, 3, this slow down, allow, and create on purpose. What would that look like? Okay, how can I go apply that in my everyday life? So I put together essentially what I do and what has worked for me. So I take this 3-pronged approach and apply it to my weekdays. My weekends are a little bit different, so I'm not going to throw those in this mix, but my 5-day week, this is what I try to do. I try to get 8 hours of sleep. Sleep is brain rest. It is key. And everyone has a different number, right? So some people really operate really well on 6 hours. Some people operate better on 10. So know what is good for you and know what allows you to feel, refreshed when you wake up. When I get up, I also don't react to anything. I don't react to my phone or technology before 8 a.m. I set a really hard barrier on that. Unless I'm meeting someone for a workout or coffee, I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not taking anything in reactively. I'm not checking my email. And that gives me that time, from like 6 a.m. until say 9 o'clock or 8 a.m. That gives me time. It gives me time to focus on what I got to do to feel good that day. And what I also do is I'll drink a glass of water right away. I'll drink my mud water, like I mentioned, or some sort of mushroom blend that allows me to get those adaptogenic benefits of mushrooms. I will also practice breath work and meditation. And then I do a really cool thing. I set an intention for the day, such as action or patience, or maybe it's calm. Sometimes I just need to relax. And then I take 3 main actions that I can take from that space. So if it's calm, I can make sure I call so-and-so and tell them calmly XYZ, right? Maybe if my intention is action, then I got to make sure I get these 3 things done. These are goals I got to make sure I get done. But by keeping it at 3, it's simple. And I start to prioritize my day so that I don't end my day in a nervous wreck. So really simple hack and journal exercise is just to write those things down in the morning and check in on them later. Movement is huge. Moving my body somehow, some way, just shakes things up. It just tends to make me feel a lot better. That can be yoga, that could be rock climbing, running, could be just doing 50 push-ups, or however many you can do. Just get that exertion going. I like to get outside and get grounded. I actually put my bare feet on the ground if I can. If I'm not in some crazy cold weather, even if you are, I challenge you to put your feet on the ground, on that cold surface, and reset your body with the electromagnetic, function of the earth. Okay. And then eat the frog. This is a term that I throw around. It's published, right? It's the idea of taking on the hardest thing you got to do that day and just doing it first. Just jumping right on it. Don't avoid it. Don't push it off. Whatever's glaring at you when you write down that list of 3 things, take the thing you want to do last and put it first. Eat the frog of the day right away. And then connect with friends. One thing I do is every week I meet with my men's group. So I belong to a men's group. I actually used to. We're taking a quick break, but I also run group programming, for instance, and meeting with guys that get me, that will hold me high, and that I can connect with in a real way outside of beer and sports is foundational to my long-term health and mental health. It's huge. So connect with friends. Also taking breaks. it's just so powerful to take breaks through the day. Give my mind a rest, give my brain a rest, and give a reset. Also, eating lunch without a screen. And then I try to set a cutoff time, like 7 p.m., no more phone, no more work. I try to cut off my screen, and I try to really just read or do something that really just lights me up, like call a friend. So that's huge. That plays into the amount of blue light that enters my eyes, so that I get a better night's sleep and I wake up even more refreshed the next day. Any questions about weekdays? Simple weekdays. All right, I'm going to jump over to weekly. Somehow, some way, I fit these things in, okay? I see a coach. For the last year and a half, I've been meeting with a coach, life coach, business coach. It's all kind of all in one. It's someone that I can go to with anything and everything that's on my mind. Think of that men's group, but they're at my fingertips whenever I need them. So finding someone I trust and I look up to and who can give it to me straight, give me direct feedback, is so foundational, so powerful for long-term mental clarity and mental health. So that's huge. I also see my functional neurologist, of course, here in San Diego. I also have a me day every week. So, Mondays are actually that for me. I focus on doing things that really light me up. It'll set me up for success for the rest of the week. I also have an adventure day. Saturday is like go on a hike, go rock climbing, go to the beach, do something like outside in nature. This is where that nature, that grounding comes into, that refresh. And then these are much more emotionally intelligent kind of filtered things. So what I like to do is I filter things and all decisions through like who I am as a person and my vivid purpose, like what my purpose is in life. Like everything I do has boundaries around it, around who I am, not someone else's idea of who I am, but who I want to be. And what I'm set out to do, what my purpose is in life. So all decisions filter through that. If I have the urge to say yes to something that's outside of that, I question it, right? I also slow down and process emotions in the moment. This is emotional awareness. This is where I slow down. If I'm feeling angry or I'm feeling sad, or, sadness tends to present as anger. So chances are if I'm feeling frustrated, I just try to slow down, process that, experience it fully, and then communicate that to whoever I'm in a relationship with, like communicate it. And in my group programs, in my men's groups, right, like we practice that. That's something we do actively. So it's kind of like the mental gym for emotional awareness. I also set weekly goals. This is where humble focus comes in. I set things that I want to make sure I get done that week, that day, that week. And I really, really focus in on that, on serving. I take responsibility and try to execute. So when I get a text message these days, I try to reply right away. Because something going on in the back of my head takes up so much brain energy. Like if I put it off and I avoid it, I procrastinate, and I say, I'll get to it later. Or I say, oh, I read that text message, but I didn't reply. And what if I forget about it? That text message is going to be in my mind all day. So what I try to do is I try to just confront in the moment. I reply to it right away. I make a decision. I don't let things linger. And that allows me to be responsible for the way that I feel long-term and just execute, just get out of business, and keeps me out of overthinking and overanalyzing. I also hold myself high. I try to, at least, right? I just try to be the captain of my life. This is something I call team captain. So meeting with my coach is one thing, but the fact that I hired a coach was the first step. Like the fact that I put myself out there and I asked somebody to literally kick me in the butt every time X, Y, and Z happens, and tell me the truth whenever X, Y, Z happens, So that's me holding myself high and going first in relationship. And this is why I currently do what I do. I put on these workshops. I show people what has worked for me, and I try to live up to that every day. So it's these 5 things. It's everything we just talked about. So I want to talk about these things really quick. I want everyone to take out a piece of paper. I want you to maybe just type on your computer, pull up a Word document, whatever it is. And we're going to take a minute or two here just to journal, just to do some reflection. We're gonna go back to that three-pronged approach, right? Three-pronged approach was slow, allow, and create. So the first prompt, you'll have a minute to just journal down all your thoughts on this. If I were to slow down more often, this is the prompt. If I were to slow down more often, I could allow myself to blank. If I were to slow down more often, I could allow myself to blank. So fill in that blank, spit out all those thoughts onto that sheet of paper, take 60 seconds, fill it up. Now the second prompt, allow. If I allowed myself to do what I just wrote about, so go ahead and reread all the things you just wrote. Reread that. And your next prompt is, if I allowed myself to do the first, I could create blank. What could you create if you allowed yourself more often to do the first part? If I allowed myself to blank, I could create blank. 60 seconds. Okay. Last prompt. Again, basing it off of the last thing you just wrote. So reread what you just wrote. All the things you could create if you allowed yourself to do the first prompt. So if the third prompt, if I created what I just wrote down, I would feel blank. How would you feel if you allowed yourself to do the first things, created the second things? I would feel blank. What would you feel? Just take 30 seconds this time. Go right to it. About 10 more seconds. And finish that on up. I'd love to take a quick share or two. I'd love to hear what you guys wrote down, if you could summarize it. What I'd like to introduce to you all next is a culmination of this program, essentially, is what I've developed is something called, that I like to call the world-class method. So the world-class method is where I focus on supporting. I've developed a method of my own that really is the cornerstone of my business. So the things we talked about a minute ago, they're all layered in here. This is phase one, is like your core identity, finding out what your identity and your values are as a man, especially if you played a sport or you were involved in something extracurricular that sort of tied up your identity, and you lost your identity potentially. And this is the way to really find that core identity again, so that you can move on to phase two, which is your vivid purpose. It's your visions, your goals, your missions, writing, producing that album, having that goal, to tack off, subconsciously, that really, having that bigger purpose, having that bigger mindset allows you to further your identity in the world. And then we move on to humble focus, how we create habits around that purpose, how we put blinders up to support us in that. That's different habits, different hacks, the things we talked about today, right? Serving, leading into responsible execution. Everything is just a dream unless we actually start acting, we start taking responsibility for what's next, like really going out there and getting uncomfortable. So this is where emotional intelligence and decision and choice comes in. The last phase is team captain. I call this leadership. This is camaraderie, it's mastery, it's forming your tribe, it's taking control, it's leading by example and bringing others with you. This is where the men's work really comes in, really supporting one another and mastering our craft, whatever that is for us. So this is the method that I use outside of the first two steps of the three-prong approach. right? We talked about slowing down, so everything from meditating to breathing to moving, to allowing. The second piece is, everything therapeutic and everything intake wise. This last piece is what we talk about creating. This is the world-class method. This is creating a life and a mindset and a brain software, I like to call it, that supports us long-term. First two steps are all about hardware. This is the software.